British Museum is often a hot topic when it comes to discussions of preservation and colonialism, and not to get into all of that quite yet, but one thing it does have going for it is its rotating assortment of exhibitions that help to bring certain time periods or artists to millions of people. One such exhibition was their 2019 Manga exhibit in collaboration with Citibank and Sainsbury's Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures, which was indeed set up by someone related to the supermarket guy and each other. But anyway, the Manga exhibition took place over 3 months, and both of us went independently of each other, and took an annoying lack of photos to use in this video 6 years later. I went with my grandmother and got to function as a human version of one of those audio tour guides. The exhibit filled one large hallway and opened with a display of the tools a mangaka might use to traditionally make manga, before opening up into a series of blown up manga panels, original manuscripts, and a few older pieces of Japanese art. But more importantly, it had a gift shop, and since I was being such a lovely granddaughter, I was able to convince her to spend £15 on a manga, which was seemingly made in collaboration with the British Museum itself. I was fascinated, even more so when I read it and got to the part where terrorists dropped Stonehenge on the glass dome of the British Museum.
What?
Munakata, Kyoju, Ikaroku, Daiei, Hakubutsukan no Bokan, or Professor Munakata's British Museum Adventure is a 2011 manga by Hoshino Yukinobu. Assuming that most of you probably haven't or won't read the manga, we're going to spoil everything. But if you really don't want spoilers, then skip to this timecode.
Now, onto the plot. Professor Munakata is a specialist in fairy tales and mythology, who has been invited as a guest lecturer at the British Museum. He is enamoured by the ethos of the museum and their ties to Japan, eager to use this as a way to broaden his understanding of both Britain and his homeland. Munakata has planned a 2-week stay to see the sights, but is sadly informed by his interpreter, Chris Caryatid, that their trip to Stonehenge has been delayed indefinitely because the whole area has been shut down for some strange reason. He gives his lecture on the power of Dogu, which are clay statues from the late Jomon period, and is based on a real exhibition in collaboration with Hoshino Yukinobu, the mangaka of this manga. The professor ends his lecture by discussing how the museum has often been accused of taking artifacts without consent, but that their devotion to spreading human knowledge and wisdom in the modern day offsets a lot of their sordid history. There's an interesting implication here, where Chris, while translating the lecture, only seems to translate the positive aspects of his speech. It's an interesting decision, and I don't totally know if we read that right, but it potentially highlights the museum's one-sided perspective on their prior actions. Meanwhile, we shift 85 miles west, to a field. An empty field, or at least empty of what was once there. Deep gouges in the dirt and a small ring of 8 rocks are all the police find of Stonehenge. I adore the way Hoshino depicts the English countryside, the endless expanse of flat grasslands that almost feel like a storm cascading over England. The use of screen tones really helps accentuate this feeling. The next day, Chris and Munakata arrive to a police presence at the museum. Those small rocks are supposedly recreations of the pawns of the Lewis chess set. Chris cheerfully chimes in that in this specific set, the pawns are often referred to as hostages. Some classic foreshadowing there from Chris. In this mystery, Munakata is our lead detective. He dashes off deep into the museum to the Elan Marbles, a series of friezes from an Athenian Parthenon, and finds a bishop from the Lewis chess set. Oh god, what is that? Anyway, it's set down proudly and terrifyingly in the centre of the room. A not so subtle request to return the sculptures to their rightful owners in exchange for their hostage, the stones of Stonehenge. An artifact for an artifact. The two proceed through the grand rooms of the museum and discover the Night Piece beside the Assyrian exhibit, which displays carved stones from an 800 BC palace. Further in, they find a warder beside the Benin bronzes in the African exhibit. All the pieces are so small in comparison, and it really shows the scale of these rooms and how many artifacts they contain. Each discovery is accompanied by Chris recounting the history of how each collection ended up in the museum, be that by consent of the ruling invaders or outright pillaging. Chris is very expositional here, but it works really well, as neither Munakata nor the audience will know the complex history of each artifact, even though some of them are highly popular. These artifacts are depicted in gorgeous detail. There's a clear respect for these artifacts from Hoshino, Hoshino to reproduce them and their intricacies. Each is immediately recognizable, adding to the informative nature of the manga. It was especially helped that several were in situ, drawn in the museum itself and then donated to it by Hoshino. Some of these panels are giving later Hunter x Hunter, but the slightly larger print actually makes this feel pretty reasonable. But anyway, a message from the terrorists is dropped off at Parliament in the form of a large stone slab engraved in Greek, Arabic, English, and Yoruba, a reference to the Rosetta Stone except using the languages of the stolen artifacts instead. And also English. The stone demands all the objects be returned to their respective countries in 2 weeks, or else the Stonehenge megaliths will be smashed. While the police investigate the scandal of the stolen stones, Munakata experiences the art of the British tea ceremony as well as getting to explore the secret archives hidden in the museum, behind seemingly innocent bookshelves. I can't believe this manga is how I found out the British Museum has secret passageways, although secret is a bit of a stretch. It is then revealed that the Lewis Chessman pieces that the thieves left were in fact the real ones and not replicas. The ones on display were replaced at some point. But how did they get stolen and replaced without anybody noticing? How long has this heist been going on for? Chris and Munakata then visit the field formerly known as Stonehenge, and the professor attempts to determine how the stones could possibly have been moved without being detected. Chris then suggests they go to the neighbouring and far less impressive Woodhenge, since they're there anyway. This is the usual train of thought that leads people to going to Woodhenge. Although Woodhenge is the same age as Stonehenge and has a unique place in the rituals of the time, it is far less spiritually enlightening to look at, so people don't tend to go. The manga then discusses the history of these places and their importance to the people who made them. Munakata is able to take these concepts into his own research of Jomon-era stone and wood circles, with stone meaning death and wood meaning life in the histories of both our islands. Artifacts like Stonehenge are interesting because they're so familiar. As a child, my family would regularly drive past Stonehenge while going on camping holidays. It was never special, it was just something that existed. Sometimes you need an outside perspective to truly appreciate the things that you've always known.
Actually, to me, who was raised moderately pagan, I went to Stonehenge quite a few times for solstice festivals and even a special birthday treat. I got to go up and touch the stones during sunrise before it was open fully to the public for the day. This was a very atypical experience, as the other children made sure I knew. Caring about big rocks in general was a frowned on part of my childhood.
Anyway, back to the story. The simple construction equipment used to remove the stones are discovered abandoned nearby, and the people who were hired to operate them have long since fled the country. The 3 countries affected publicly declare that this is an action of an unrelated third party, and they have no intent to try and claim the artifacts, nor use the publicity to strong-arm the British Museum for their own benefit. This makes the return a little diplomatically difficult. It seems that either they'll have to piss off these 3 countries, or let the stones be destroyed. The story presents the artifacts as a political tool as well as a cultural one, a very apt use of their place in real-world history and politics. The story in general is fantastical, but is only 1 or 2 steps removed from reality. It's pretty believable considering the plot can be summed up as terrorists steal Stonehenge, especially with more recent real-world events, such as Just Stop Oil's attack on art pieces and, other art-related crimes. The pair return to the museum, which is in a frenzy, and the museum director, in the most English manner, is trying to keep calm and carry on. Munakata then meets Laura, the curator of the Japanese collection, who is alluded to be a massive weeb, and they explore the museum's Japanese section while a security guard ominously watches over them. The next morning, Munakata awakes to the police kicking in his door and a king chess piece resting on his windowsill. A normal morning for Munakata, going by his calm demeanor. I cannot get over how London is depicted here. The dark city streets are gorgeous, but look at this overcast sky. A storm is brewing. The architecture is replicated in incredible detail, and while almost definitely based on reference images or his own trips to London, they all seem meticulously hand-drawn. Cleared of suspicion because of, reasons, Munakata and Chris ponder the strange mystery of the stones over sake, her apartment filled with various Japanese items from her travels. I love that Hoshino knows exactly how weebs operate, but even surrounded by familiar items, Munakata can't relax. Something doesn't quite add up. Munakata then realizes the chess piece was a hint, and he says to himself he's been told to either figure it out quickly or go back to Japan. And so he does. But not before eating an entire apple in one bite. He surmises the king piece is supposed to represent the King of England, and the hotel floor told him which one. King George III, the only English king with a 3 in his name. And it just so happens the museum has an artifact inscribed with his name, the Rosetta Stone. The story spends a good amount of time discussing the morally grey histories of these artifacts, a lot of which I didn't know. King George III inscribing his name on the Rosetta Stone is by the way. Although if you go and visit now, it's really hard to see. Later that day, Heathrow Airport announces that strange objects were seen over the Stonehenge site at the time of the theft, and the megaliths were most likely airlifted instead of moved over land after their extraction. An impressive feat considering each megalith weighs several tons. Munakata then goes to eat British food and likes it. Checkmate Americans. And also, Chris solves the mystery of how the pyramids were built. While heading home, Chris and Munakata happen across a security guard doing the opposite of security as he places a queen chess piece between 2 lion statues outside the building. I think it's these statues? I'm not super sure though. They chase him into the museum and discover a secret tunnel leading to an even more secret room. The original Lewis Chessman board and the plans for the whole plot quickly vanish before their eyes in the blazing inferno the security guard ignited to cover his tracks. They travel up through more secret passages in the round reading room, emerging out onto the roof of the museum. The security guard is seemingly concerned as police gather outside, and Munakata and the museum staff block the way back. The security guard reaches to the sky and is pulled away by a black stealth airship, Daughter of 20 Faces style. Then huge rocks are dropped onto the glass roof, smashing through and destroying parts of the museum. Luckily, our characters don't get reduced into a fine mist, and the damage is limited by the rocks being concrete and not the real Stonehenge stones, thus preventing the terrorists from being hypocrites. Whew! I was not expecting a chase scene in the history-filled detective manga, and it just gets more intense from here. Inside the damaged but not ruined museum, the other queen piece is found between another pair of lion statues. But what are the actual targets of these placements? Our dynamic duo investigate the secret room for any clues. In the remains, they find plans dating back to the 1800s, devising a method to steal the Stonehenge megaliths. Megaliths is a really hard word. As well as a drawing of a pair of twin lions. In plain view sits the chessman pieces that were stolen and had not left the museum at all, kept close and hidden to be recreated in this strange room deep underground. With the real target now revealed as being the Rosetta Stone, and most of the rest being red herrings, a few questions are left for Professor Munakata. Why did they want it specifically? Who was the security guard working for? And who built this secret room? With these questions and a suspect in mind, they leave to follow the lead. They search the house of the security guard, whose surname, Singh, means lion in Sanskrit, and discover aerial views of Windsor Castle, one of the many royal houses, especially as the queen chess piece between the lions looked up at the engraving on the round reading room, the Queen Elizabeth II Great Court. They also discover a large empty underground hangar built over many generations, just large enough to hide 1 or maybe 2 airships. Our suspicious security guard is discovered to be the adopted son of the Pullen family, a family who worked for the British Museum for generations, one member even being the construction supervisor for the round reading room. Their house seems mostly abandoned, with our suspect having moved on with his plans. The museum continues to operate despite the damage. Munakata, with his big ol' brain, realizes that the twin lions in the secret room were depicting the twin lions of France, Napoleon and Champollion. Napoleon had acquired the Rosetta Stone during his campaign in Egypt, and Champollion was a prolific Egyptologist attempting to translate the hieroglyphics. After Napoleon's defeat, not only was the Rosetta Stone stolen from him, his letters to his wife detailing her potential infidelity were also stolen and published in English newspapers. Nice to know we've kept up the tradition of tabloid celeb cheating scandals. Meanwhile, Champollion had to struggle with secondary sources for his research, while the British Egyptologists had direct access, and the British were not keen on sharing.
Munakata theorizes that the humiliated Napoleon hired a spy and thief named Poulin to steal the Rosetta Stone back from the British, even if he did not get to see its recovery. Once the original 2 men died, Poulin's family continued their clandestine work, and 200 years later were finally about to succeed. The deadline draws near, and Singh calls them with a final taunt. If they give in and return the Rosetta Stone, it'll set a precedent for other countries to have their artifacts returned too. But if they don't, then the megaliths will be destroyed. A tricky choice. To signify the museum accepting this outcome, they must hoist the French flag above the main entrance, which is honestly worse than the terrorism. This exchange directly addressed the core issue the British Museum faces. If they return one artifact, they will have to return all the contested artifacts. While sightseeing on the London Eye, Chris explains how St Paul's Cathedral houses the tombs of the Duke of Wellington and Lord Nelson, who both defeated Napoleon, just in time for them to watch the stealth airship appear above the cathedral, megaliths loaded like bombs ready to devastate all that lies below. The ship anchors itself to the dome of St Paul's so it can't be removed, or if it is shot down, it'll plummet into the cathedral, destroying everything anyway. The situation seems dire. The final morning comes, and the museum raises a Union Jack in defiance of their demands. At the same time, the police deploy a small airship of their own, intending to sneak under and catch the wires to drag the airship over the Thames, where the destruction to human and architecture will be minimised. Luckily, nothing can survive in the Thames, and so there will be no environmental fallout from this. Not kidding. The Thames was declared ecologically dead in 1957, and only recently shook that label in 2021. 10 years after the manga was written. They successfully snagged the wires and released them with a series of small detonations, flying the airship up and around the bridges of London, before finally using the London Eye as a pulley and securing the megaliths over the river. This is supposedly a plan derived from a potential methodology of moving the stones used in the construction of the Great Pyramids of Giza, but in reverse. It's a tenuous link, but you know, inspiration isn't always so linear. Anticipating some sort of meddling, the airship self-destructs, plunging several hundred tons of rock into the Thames to be retrieved later. Somehow. The riverbed does not like to share its treasures. Trust me, I was raised by a mudlarker, and that bastard still has at least one of my shoes.
The colour pages for this section are gorgeous, the explosion bathing everything in hues of red and oranges, contrasting beautifully with the sea of a cityscape down below. The silhouette of the airship is a void cutting through the colour as if so hidden it can't be detected. The police turn to thank Munakata for his ingenious plan, but much with the airship, the professor is undetectable. In silence, we watch a second airship descend upon the neglected museum, ropes lower into the hole in the roof while a truck quietly moves through the museum to the Rosetta Stone, smashing through the glass and collecting the artifact like rubble and offering it up to the hanging wires like a sacrifice. The lights come on and Munakata stands there with police in tow. Taking a leaf from the thieves, the Rosetta Stone has been replaced with a fake and their plan was for nothing. Singh yells for Laura to escape without him. Laura, the director of the Japanese section of the museum, wasn't just a weeb, but was also a terrorist, acrobat, and aircraft pilot. Through an off-screen background check earlier, Munakata discovers that she is also a descendant of Pulin. She refuses to surrender, as she'll be dead for crossing the countries that bankrolled them, and proceeds to get shot through the head by a sniper. Having lost his colleague and second cousin or something, Singh decides to go all in and destroy everything in the museum. Chris throws herself in front of the bulldozer to protect the artifacts and is run over for this transgression. As she lays, dying, she requests the artifacts that she acquired on her travels be donated to the museum so she can be a part of it after her death. Her final sacrifice for the museum, and a representation of all the people who've died protecting it, truly embodying the caryatids of her namesake. Caryatids. Munakata leaves England with an appreciation for all the people who had laid down their lives for the museum. The stones are dredged from the bottom of the Thames, and the sniper that killed Laura was never found. The true extent of this secret organisation is yet unknown, even though a few people were arrested. Jesus Christ, that got dark! And you said you bought this at the British Museum?
So that was the story of a book I got from a museum gift shop about destroying said same museum. But how did it come to be? What is the story of this story? This manga is neither Professor Munakata or Hoshino Yukinobu's first foray into the British Museum. Hoshino in fact had his own exhibit at the British Museum for 3 months at the end of 2009, to highlight his work as a mangaka. As part of this, he drew some pieces to be displayed directly in the exhibit while on site. Most of these included his character Professor Munakata exploring the British Museum, with great attention to detail of the artifacts depicted. Shortly after this, Hoshino was inspired to create a whole arc of his manga around Professor Munakata's adventures at the museum. Professor Munakata himself started his adventures in 1994 in Munakata Kyoju Denkiko, which ran for 42 chapters until 2008, moving on to a second series, Munakata Kyoju Ikko Roku, which had 49 chapters running from 2004 to 2010, with 10 chapters of this being the British Museum arc. From the start, the manga was intended to receive a standalone publication via the British Museum Press, which publishes research relating to the museum artifacts as well as books associated with collections or exhibits. Most of these are non-fiction, but there are some fiction books such as classical or translated novels. The British Museum Press handled the translation for Professor Munakata's British Museum adventure, as well as added a brief introductory history on manga. This means these chapters are the only official English translation of any of the 100 or so chapters in the series, and one of only a few of his works translated into English at all. As ever, France got many more, as well as some being translated into Italian. The foreword of the manga, by the then British Museum director Neil MacGregor, outright acknowledges the fact that publishing a book about your own workplace's destruction is a little strange. MacGregor is known for his attempts for the museum to reach outside of the usual Eurocentric exhibitions, which helped it recover from financial difficulties. Despite pushing for exhibits on Chinese, Muslim, and Persian history, he was staunchly opposed to the return of the Elgin marbles. The museum is very open about the history of where the artifacts it displays have come from, with a whole category of their website devoted to contested objects. And while they're often open about this, they do make it clear the museum believes in their right to keep the objects. Both the Benin bronzes and Parthenon sculptures of reality have the same history as discussed in the manga. In fact, in general, the manga is incredibly historically accurate. The close ties with the museum enabled this as much as it may have caused Hoshino to want to push or pull the story in certain ways. In an opening interview with the translator of the volume, Hoshino specifies that he did not let the collaboration adjust the story he wished to tell, or that it was meant as an advertisement of the museum. He also discusses how he hopes the manga can create conversation and spread knowledge, which I'd say it does quite well. There is a contemplative feeling to his work, and it feels a lot is left up to the reader to interpret. We're both English, and so this manga was incredibly interesting, as it presented a very external perspective of familiar concepts and places. One such being the British Museum and its place in colonial history. The manga presents a relatively neutral opinion on the debate, unabashedly recounting the museum's colonial history, but also appreciating its long-running devotion to preserving and continuing history. The story actually shifted my opinion on the British Museum slightly. I find my relationship to the museum is conflicted. On one hand, the global perception of the museum is as a symbol of colonization and theft. But on the other hand, most of the artifacts would have been lost to time, if not for rich academics with too much time on their hands. Most artifacts were deemed worthless during their time, and only in their preservation are we able to unlock their value. A bronze knife in the Bronze Age was a common sight, but now it's priceless. To add to this, a lot of artifacts and pieces of art go on tour around the world for everyone to see, and it's mostly for free. They do charge admin fees and require the objects be insured. It seems relatively minor, but could still be a hurdle for less well-off museums. And that unfortunately adds to the idea that only we, the sophisticated British folk, are smart enough to take care of these treasures, and that's, not great. The museum does attempt to spread knowledge to other museums, with yearly training programs for global museum workers. These are small scale, but very specific in their approach and target. Both Benin and Iraq, two of the targets in the manga, also have specific research and training projects associated with the museum. Both were started over 10 years after the manga, so it's doubtful it had much play in the decision. And Hoshino was pulling on pre-existing complaints going back to at least the 1960s. We're huge proponents of media preservation, but legally a lot of that work is theft, and companies can and will sue you for preserving media they own the copyright to, even if they have no intent to ever sell it again. The Internet Archive is even under threat because these companies care so little about preserving media. But in 40, 50, 60 years, when the only reason we can still play old games or watch old TV shows is because of theft, will the people be happy it happened? Truly, I don't know. And I don't think Hoshino knows either. I think it's funny that the antagonist of the story wants to give the Rosetta Stone back to the French, like it was theirs to begin with. Maybe these artifacts are just tools for the rich and powerful to extend their influence. Is that too out of the scope for this video? No, you're trapped here. And we're going to talk about nuanced socio-political stuff? The Rosetta Stone was created in 198 BC, under the instruction of King Ptolemy V Epiphanes, and features the three common languages of his kingdom: Egyptian, Greek, and Demotic, with the last being a formal form of Egyptian that utilised the different scripts, the usual hieroglyphics. The stone itself is a fragment of a larger object, but the exact size is unknown. Because of this, all three sections have varying levels of damage, which affected translation efforts. However, most of the decree is now understood. Erected on the day of the king's coronation, declaring that the priests accept him as their divine ruler. It lists the great deeds the 13-year-old king had done, which includes investing in the temples, promising peace, and reducing taxes. To honour him, the temples would celebrate his coronation and birthday as festivals, and erect statues in his honour. The stone then decrees it should be written in Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphics, and be reproduced to be placed in other temples. It probably remained in the temple it was placed in for some 600 years, before the Romans ordered all non-Christian places of worship to be closed. We do not know exactly which temple it was in, or when it was broken. A millennia after this, the stone, along with other ruins of the ancient Egyptians, were acquired by the Mamluk Sultan Kuwait Bey to be used in the foundations of a fortress. It was another 3 centuries before it was found by the invading French, by chance, after breaking a hole in the wall near the fort, and figured it could be of interest to their newly established Institut d'Egypte, and so it was shipped to Cairo for study. Reproductions were made and distributed across Europe in the hope of finally deciphering hieroglyphics, which was also lost to Egyptians of the time. Eventually, the British forces began to push into North Africa, and the hopeful French brought the artifacts with them to bring back to France after their victory. But there was no victory. The French tried to negotiate that the items belonged to the Institute, and the British refused to stop the attack unless they got everything. The exact details are unknown, but the outcome was that the Rosetta Stone came home with the British Army and was presented to King George III. It was then lent to the Society of Antiquities of London, who created casts of it for various British universities before handing it over to the British Museum, where it has remained since. Now we know what the Rosetta Stone is, and its entire history. Let's question each step. The initial temple that owned it was one of at least 4 that have now been found to have copies, so we know it was an item intended to be reproduced, and was functionally a declaration of the religious backing of the king. It is a mundane item, and was not entirely unique. Of course, such items are highly useful for social understanding, and scarcity is often inconsistent as a metric of value in archaeology. At some point, the temple and the stone within became under the ownership of the Roman Empire, who had the temple closed and seemingly did little with anything inside. Instead, more worried about social control than masonry. This is a relatively banal time for the stone, as it was just a change of the hands of the land it existed on that occurred. These hands then became the Ottoman Empire, who used it as rubble for a war effort. If you found a piece of broken and worn pottery in your garden, how much would you consider its history before using it in your fish pond? Even at this point, it was ancient history, but the desperations of war often caused social norms to be disregarded. This is not a good thing, of course, and the Ottomans did covet knowledge, but it was more in the pursuit of mathematics and physics, not history. The French were the ones to find it and first recognised the value it could have to understanding ancient Egyptian, which had been lost to time for the Egyptians of the 18th century, although attempts had been made previously. Having rescued it, they could have just taken casts and left the stone in the hands of Egypt itself. But the stone had value as a soft power play, especially as Cairo at that time was under Napoleon's rule. So who would they leave it with? The stone was just one part of a campaign to take over the whole country. The British saw it much the same, and also could use the acquisition to embarrass the French. They could have also left it in Egypt, but that was a contested war zone, and it would be far safer at home in the hands of scholars. And so, when looking back for all this, we have to think about how many people had taken this land as their own. Borders have moved, and empires have risen and fallen. Roman, Byzantine, Ottoman, French, British, they had all left their mark, and their people. The Copts are considered the ethnicity descendant from the Pharaonic era. They make up about 5% of the current population of Egypt, with some estimates saying anything up to 20. This is pretty good. There's still a lineage alive. Not all people were so lucky, such as the Picts of modern-day Scotland or the Gafat of ancient Ethiopia. However, of these descendants, how many would be in the position to receive the artifacts, and how integrated into wider Egyptian society are they? They are a big minority, and one that is represented in all institutional and political sects of Egypt. So it seems likely that both the people and place are able to accept the Rosetta Stone back. Not always the case for ancient artifacts, but this is just the blood relatives. The stone also had immense cultural value, with it being a prime piece of scientific history for, well, France mostly. They were the ones who deciphered it, but that was just one man, and he's also dead now. Any ownership from the French or British would be out of historical value, and there is a longer history than that at play. So then we have to ask, do they even want it back? Some countries are happy to have their artifacts on display in the British Museum, or are not around anymore to complain. Egypt is not one of them, however. Their first requests were in 2003. Their reasoning was that it had become iconic of the Egyptian identity and cultural heritage. However, it was also part of the British Museum's heritage, and arguably its history is what popularised it as a staple of Egyptian culture. They didn't want to hand it over to one specific country when they represented a far more international reach. But are they international? Many other museums also rejected repatriation requests from Egypt in this way, but is it an international museum when you're located in one country? As part of making this video, we went to the British Museum, mostly to get B-roll and photos, but also because we have that privilege. A train ride or so and we were there. And honestly, the manga had really inspired both of us to want to go. While we were there, we paid close attention to the relevant parts in Munakata's adventure, but also in general. And it was busy. Really busy. Even on a weekday, students and school kids and international students were all lined up to see and study these objects. And I couldn't help but think, how many would be there if they had to visit a dozen countries just to get the same experience? Does the variety bring value to the artifacts they wouldn't otherwise have? Would schools arrange big trips for a smaller experience? Would we have stumbled upon such interesting objects while getting lost if they were all 1,000 miles apart? This is why it's tricky to answer, and ultimately it's easier to do nothing, especially when nothing means you get to keep your prized possessions millions come to see each year.
Professor Munakata's British Museum Adventures is a seinen manga, and even by that standard it is very mature. Hoshino often self-identified as a Gekiga author, not a manga author, and equally understood his work as intellectual. It definitely raises the issues around the British Museum with enough information and a few answers to encourage personal opinion. The fact the terrorists are just as warped and hypocritical down the generations is an interesting characterization to give your antagonists. I think one of the few things I disliked about this manga is Professor Munakata himself. He's great, but he's also very flat, and almost a plot device to carry us through the story being told. It has at least intrigued me enough to read the rest of his work, just to see what he's like exploring his home country of Japan. I certainly learnt a lot while reading this manga, and it got us to visit the museum with a fresh perspective. So in that respect, not only is it a good story, but it's also a great advertisement. I felt forced to look genuinely critically at a monolithic institution. Our conclusion being slightly positive might annoy some people, so if you disagree with us or the manga, let us know down in the comments. I would love to hear your perspective. I've always felt that England and Japan share a lot of similarities in terms of culture and history, so I love seeing these collaborations. Now we just have to get around to making a video on the best TV show ever. Giri Haji. Thank you very much for watching, we hope you enjoyed it. If you did, feel free to hit like and subscribe and all the good stuff. Our thumbnail for this video was created by the very talented Brioche, so check out her socials on screen and in the description. That's all for this video, see you next time, bye!